Hi everyone, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to draw a dark bay horse in pastels. Now the techniques that I'm going to share in this video can be applied when drawing any darker coloured horse. We're going to be working predominantly from dark to light. Now before I start working on the hair, any area of the face, I always start with the eye. Now here, as always, that's where the emotion and expression stems from, so once I know I've got that right, I can start mapping in everything around it. Now I do like to work in small manageable chunks rather than individual layers across the entire subject. I just feel that I'm far more motivated, because if I was to leave this at this current stage and go away from my easel for a couple of hours, it is already starting to look like that reference photo. Now one thing that can happen is if you end up hesitating, looking at your reference photo thinking, or where should I be working, it's usually an indication that we are working on a bit more of a larger area. So I would always try to just scale that down slightly. Now onto the base layers here, I am using just my pastel pencils. Now you could of course use pan pastels or soft pastel sticks, but I do like to use a different variety just so that it keeps everything a little bit more varied. It also shows that you don't have to have all of the pastel supplies in order to create photorealistic portraits. Now this here, for my base layers, I'm just purely mapping in my main lights and darks. You can see here that again I'm working in 1 or 2 square inches at a time. And the one thing that I wanted to capture with this horse is the beautiful shine on the coat. Being how dark and rich that colour is, the sun and the lighting was just really glistening and bouncing off of the different features on the face. Now this is something to pay very close attention to. Because the skin on horses' faces is quite thin compared to other animals, you're going to see more of the structures under the skin and the muscles. So the eye sockets, the cheekbones, those are more pronounced. Now in terms of the highlights and shadows here, that again is following that main structure under the skin. So that is going to have to be really matched and paired accurately with the fur or hair direction. So here is a prime example. You can see that I've got 2 what look like curved ridges, and that's going to hint at where the eye socket meets the top section of the skull. If I don't have my highlights and shadows in the right place, I'm going to change the shape of the face, so it could either end up too narrow or too wide. And if I don't then have the fur or hair direction going in the right way, in the way that it's curved, then that again can also affect the shape of the face. So these 2 things are really important to pay very close attention to, right from the first base layers all the way up to your final details. Now when it comes to those base layers, in all of my tutorials here on YouTube, I put a lot of focus on how important I feel this layer is. This is our foundation for our details, so I do personally like to make sure that I get this as accurate as I can. Now of course, although we're going to be layering our pencils on top, we can adjust this base layer as many times as we need, as long as we don't apply too much pigment and fill the tooth of the paper. But if I can map in accurately my lights and my darks, I do know that it's easier for me to follow that reference photo, and my portrait's going to be more accurate from the start all the way up again to those final details. Now in terms of these base layers, if you're using your pencils and building up their layers as I am here working with your lighter pencils, and you do find that they're not quite showing up in the right way, it's usually because the base layer underneath isn't dark enough. Now this is a common problem that happens when we are drawing such dark subjects, so I would always recommend that if you ever do feel that that pencil is not showing up but you think it should, go ahead and darken your base layer a little bit more, and then you'll find that that issue should be resolved. But here you can see that I'm still able to get nice lighter details even though I've got my base layers here really dark. Now the one thing that's going to massively affect that is the paper. So I have tried quite a few papers that are advertised and mentioned that they're perfect for pastels, but the only paper that I've found that truly works so well with this great medium is Pastelmat by Clairefontaine. Now that allows for a huge number of layers, and you can see that throughout this tutorial here. There are so many layers and details that are being added, and even once this portrait was finished, I was nowhere near filling the tooth of the paper, so if I needed to go and add more details, I could easily have done that. Now the pencils that I'm using here are a mixture of Carbothello, Pitt, Derwent and Caran. Now typically I would be mainly using my Carbothello and my Pitt pastels, they're my go-to, but there are a few of the Derwent and Caran colours that I do like to have in my set. Now the one thing here, in terms of the forelock and the mane of any horses, I would probably say this is one of the more complex elements because they're often quite thick, they've got a lot of hair, they're really dense, and this could be one of those situations where we think, where do we start? Now this is something that I cover in my in-depth tutorials on Patreon. I don't have this tutorial available on Patreon because this was a pet portrait that I have completed myself, but I do have a range of horse tutorials there, all showing this element from start to finish. So I do have a Patreon library on my website I'll link that all in the description below, that has a full list of all tutorials, so you can see exactly what's there before you sign up and join Patreon if you did want to do that. And with Patreon it's really flexible, you can stay for as long as you want or you can cancel at any time. And as soon as you do join the tier that you're interested in, you get immediate access to all content that I've uploaded. So it's a really great way, good value for money. It's a great way of learning different techniques because I've got a huge range of variety of animals. So before I move on to the mane and the neck portion of this portrait, if this tutorial has been helpful so far, I would really appreciate it if you could give it a like and a thumbs up because it makes a huge difference to my channel. I'd be really, really grateful. And I do upload 2 to 3 videos here to YouTube every week, so if you'd like to get notified of that content, then hit the subscribe and the bell button. Now onto the rest of the face, and it is very much a rinse and repeat process for the base layer, so I'm still looking at mapping in my lights and my darks. But the one thing as I work with my pastel pencils and start to put in the details is I'm going to vary my pencil technique. Now I have a video here on YouTube, it's my top tips for drawing realistic fur in pastels. I'll link that in the description below if it's of interest. But there I talk about 3 main things. I've got the fur or hair direction, which I've already spoken about in this tutorial. I've then got the fur thickness and fur length. Now typically as we work on horse portraits and we get closer to the nose and the mouth area, the hair needs to be a little bit shorter. So if I were to use the same pencil technique, I'm going to make this section of the face look fluffier than it should do. So that is something that I do always pay very close attention to. In some cases, especially on big cats, for instance, lions or tigers, this area closer to the nose, you may actually need to just dot rather than creating individual lines for your details. Now one thing that I've briefly mentioned here is about filling the tooth of the paper. Now this can happen fairly easily when working with pastels, especially during those first few initial stages. So what I do now is record all of my Patreon tutorials with a voiceover while I'm drawing, so there are no sections sped up or cut out. Now what that enables me to do is explain exactly how much pigment I'm applying, exactly what techniques I'm using in the moment, and I do feel that that enables every single process to never be rushed over. Now the one thing as well is if I make a mistake, which does happen, it's part of the learning process, I will always include that in my tutorials. There are no secrets, there really are no sections cut out at all. So that there is what enables us to grow as an artist. If we make a mistake, it does sometimes make us worry or panic a little bit, but it's knowing how to fix it that's so important. When we do fix that, we've then gained so much more additional information that we can put towards the next portrait. But if filling the tooth of the paper is something that does happen when you work with pastels, I do usually find that it's the first 2 or 3 layers that make that happen. So whether or not it's because we've maybe subconsciously rushed through that first stage a little bit too much, and we've applied too much pigment in order to get that step done quicker, that may be the cause, especially if we're working with something like pan pastels. Now because pan pastels have a really soft pigment, I do find they're far easier to fill the tooth of the paper rather than just, for instance, using the pastel pencils from start to finish. And because of that, I do have quite a lot of tutorials on Patreon that really do show how to use pan pastels, how to avoid filling the tooth of the paper, and what to do if that happens. So you could apply a workable fixative if the portrait's not finished. That will put tooth back to that paper so you can carry on building your layers. But the one thing to really pay attention to when you are using a fixative is they will change the colour and tonal values of your artwork. So your lights will probably end up a little bit dull and your colours could shift. However, if you haven't finished that portrait and you are using it as a workable fixative, knowing that you've got layers to put on top, then that's maybe not so much of a problem. But certainly if you're nearer to completion of that portrait, then that's something that does make it a little bit more tricky. Now if you are using a fixative, I would always recommend to use light layers. So do one light layer, wait for that to dry and apply another lighter layer rather than doing one heavier layer. That's going to mean likely then that you're going to have a portrait that's not as affected by that fixative. Now I speak from experience with that because I did use a fixative once and obviously applied a bit too much of a heavier layer and my details just almost dissolved. It just completely ruined the portrait. Ever since then I've never used a fixative, and I always make sure that by doing the correct layering process, as I am here, building up my layers gradually, that I never find the need to add and use a fixative at all. Now because I know that this is a topic that gets asked so frequently here on YouTube and also on social media, if you've got any questions about the fixative process or filling the tooth of the paper, any art related questions really, feel free to pop them in the comments below because I'm more than happy to help if I can. Now the one thing to pay very close attention to when working on noses of any animal is that the nostrils are in the right place and that you've got the correct separation between the top lip and the bottom lip. So you do want to make sure that you've got the curve right, you've got the width, the length of that right as well. Now if the highlights are not in the right place on the nostrils, it can be really distracting. Quite often, because the nose is going to be in the centre of the face, it's going to be very obvious if that's drawn wrong. Even if someone doesn't have the reference photo, they can probably tell that something's just not quite right. So do pay very close attention to that reference photo and really try to take in all of those subtle lights and dark changes. Now when we get to the end of the portrait here, try not to rush it either, because this unfortunately would then bring down the entire portrait. So just because it's the neck of the animal and not the face, make sure that it gets the right amount of time that it needs. So I do hope that this video has been useful. As I've said, if you could give it a like and a thumbs up if it was, I'd be very, very grateful. And if you are interested in any of my in-depth step-by-step tutorials on Patreon, then all of that is linked in the description below. Here is a photograph of my finished portrait, and I'm going to be uploading another video to YouTube next week. And as always, thank you so much for watching.